Welcome to this episode of the Co-Political Podcast, and I believe the fourth episode of our general election special.
Yes, indeed.
It's closer than it's ever been before, because that's how time works.
Well done.
And we're covering the Conservative Party's manifesto.
Yep, as usual, I'm October, and I'm with my co-host.
Hayden.
Yes,
I'm Hayden. And I have spent my Friday afternoon reading through 80 pages of the Conservative Party's policies because I have nothing better to do, clearly.
God's work.
Exactly. Someone has to do it.
Exactly, and I wish I could, but I've got a functioning job.
Alright, no need for backhanded insults.
Anyway, let's get this show on the road.
October. Now, October, could you give us a short introduction into the beliefs and ideologies in the Conservative Party for our less informed listeners?
Yes, I can. So the Conservative Party are the UK's main right-wing party. It's rather a broad church party. There's a left and a right of the right wing over here. In recent years, the Tories, as their most common nickname goes, they've moved a little further right. They've been shifting to the right of politics. As of recent, there's been a bit of a loss to the more moderate right-wing follower base. Yeah, there's been a shift from the centre. Perhaps proof of that is in recent defections. Is that a word?
Yes, defections is the word.
Oh, good. God, I'm on fire today already. Recent defections to Labour, such as Dan Poulter and notably Natalie Elphicke, who is quite local to us. Dover and Deal, I believe.
Yes.
Stating that she wants a party that is, covering the centre ground of politics, which I'm sure we'll cover in the Labour manifesto, I believe, tomorrow.
Yes. So I should mention on that front, our schedule until the general election is the Conservative manifesto this episode, Labour's manifesto for the next episode, Liberal Democrats manifesto after that, and a combined episode with the Greens and Reform UK before the day before polling day, where we have a quick briefing on what you need to know about voting.
Yes.
Anyway, back to you, October. Any more points?
A brief explanation of the Conservative Party's ideology. It's kind of in the name. Fiscally, money saving, I suppose. Socially, how on earth do I explain this?
More traditionalist.
Yes, traditional. Quite traditionalist. Especially recently, we've seen a lot on gender ideology. And
the culture war especially, yeah.
Yes, that has in fact been triggered by Conservatives.
Yes.
But that fits in with their ideologies.
They tend to be more small government than big government, so we would describe them as more liberal than authoritarian, per se.
Yes, certainly.
If you're into your political compass axes, that's it. That is.
I used to use them a lot when I was younger. I don't know how it works anymore. Anyway, shall we delve in to their actual manifesto? When was the manifesto released? Do you know, Hayden?
I don't have the exact date that the manifesto was released, but they were all released around sometime last week or the week before.
Mid-June, I believe.
Yes.
Yes.
But the important question is actually what is in the manifesto. Now, the Conservatives break down their manifesto into a lot of sections. They all do have quite lengthy titles, so we've simplified them for the purposes of this podcast episode. So the first section is economic development. Now, in this section, the Conservatives discuss their plan to develop the UK's economy.
Yes.
So, the main policy points to know. The Conservatives commit to not raising corporate tax, and they wish to abolish the main rate of national insurance entirely. They have a 10-point plan to support small and medium enterprises with policies like keeping the value-added tax threshold under review, securing a £250 million Invest in Women fund, and working with the public sector to ensure procurement opportunities go to smaller and medium enterprises. They want to give £4.7 billion to smaller cities, towns and rural areas in the North and Midlands. They want to put £8.3 billion towards potholes and £8.55 billion for cities.
Before you continue, Hayden, can you delve a little deeper into the things with national insurance? What does that mean for money?
So it means for the average person that they will end up paying less tax and they will pay less national insurance contribution over time. And especially, it will especially apply to workers and especially self-employed people, as we'll mention later on in what I believe is our taxes and pensions section.
Yep, that is
But
next.
this one is mainly about the main rate of NI for businesses, I believe. So that policy will impact mainly businesses, whereas other policies we'll mention in the next section will impact mainly working people and mean less taxes paid and less national insurance contributions.
Splendid.
Anyway,
Do continue.
where was I? Oh yes, they are committing to Northern Powerhouse Rail, which is a scheme to improve rail connectivity in the north, and they want to boost rail connectivity in the Midlands, including the Midlands Rail Hub being funded in full. They'll reopen lines cut in the Beeching Cuts, which was where, back in the times of British Rail, a report was released which basically led to the cut of many rail lines across the UK, termed the Beeching Cuts because it was done by Dr. Beeching. Increase public spending on research and development by 2 billion. Civil service returns to pre-pandemic size to fund an increase in defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, which will be covered later. They also want to control the civil service's ability to create and enter diversity, equality and inclusion initiatives. So we're starting to see the crop up of the cultural rhetoric, and they want to move 25,000 civil servants outside of London. So there's the section on economic development, and there's the key points you would want to know. Any points, October, or would you like to move us on to taxes and pensions?
Let's shift to taxes and pensions. So, in the Conservative Party manifesto, there is a pledge to cut national insurance to 6% by April 2024. I believe
2027.
Yeah, I'm not sure why I said 2024. 2027, I fear I can't read. And I believe the total abolition of Class 4 national insurance contribution is going to be in play, which is aimed more towards self-employed folk.
Yes. So on that point,
Go
Class 4, you'll only pay Class 4 national insurance if you're self-employed, and I believe they estimate somewhere in the region of 90% of self-employed people would pay either less or no longer pay national insurance contribution. So if you're self-employed, that's an important point to take under consideration.
And, as I've been saying for the past couple episodes, that may affect your vote. You need to make that vote.
Yes, the reason we're producing these episodes is to help you decide who to vote for in the general election, but to actually be able to decide who you're going to vote for. At some point, you're going to have to vote. So make sure, get out and vote July the 4th.
And bring
Back to you,
photo ID.
October.
Yes.
And bring photo ID.
Now, there's a further pledge to not raise income tax or value-added tax, which might be nice, I suppose. The maintenance of national living wage at 2/3 of median earnings is...
So median earnings would mean like the middle of the wages. So if you took everyone in the country, lined them up in wage order, it'd be the person smack bang in the middle. So living wage would be permanently at 2/3 of that.
Yes, indeed. There's a new triple lock plus policy for pensions, which implies that state pensions will raise in line with the highest of prices, earnings, or 2.5%, and tax-free personal allowance raises by the same, implying that state pension is always going to be tax-free, and no additional taxes on pensions themselves. Anything
so basically, if the Conservatives win, your pension will always be tax-free, as long as that's the state pension, of course.
However,
moving on.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
It may be important to imply that a lot of political parties make promises, and don't always stick to them.
Yes,
but
this is their manifesto. They are not legally required to follow this. So if they chuck some of this out later on, well, politicians, right?
Well, that's an interesting point, Hadyn. Do you think, if you had the power to change this, do you think parties should be required to stick to their manifestos, if not only be able to add to it and not go back on things? What do you think about that?
No, I would allow parties to, because sometimes there's a good reason. Like, of course, politicians are going to lie, but there's sometimes good reasons to change manifestos, and you don't want to bankrupt the country by forcing politicians to stick to promises from 4 old years ago.
That's fair enough.
Anyway, should we cover families?
Yes.
When considering families, the Conservatives would want a family hub, which is basically a youth hub, plus a Sure Start Centre, which is basically a centre that helps new mothers, new parents and infants in every local authority in England, so not Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland.
I believe some of them have popped up recently, actually.
Some of them have popped up,
especially
but
around here.
They're not in lots of places at the moment.
Certainly.
So if you don't have a family hub near you, that's a policy to pay attention to. Child benefit will be moved from an individual basis to a household basis, and the benefits will be gradually reduced and removed as the combined household income gets in the range of £120,000 to £160,000. So if you're getting like £140,000 as your combined household income, your benefits will start to level off. And as you get to that £160,000 range, it will just disappear entirely. And they also commit to a statutory ban on mobile phones in schools during the school day. So, school-aged children, if the Conservative win, no phones at school for you. But any thoughts, October?
Well, mainly just everything you've said. Definitely something to think about. How do I word this?
I do think it's interesting though that the people who will care most about the ban on mobile phones during the school day is either teachers. I think teachers, most of the teachers I speak to, they say mobile phones are actually really useful for schools now.
Yeah, exactly. I've been using them during sixth form because, well, my school's Wi-Fi isn't the best, shall we say. They definitely can be an aid, and sometimes for disabled students they can be a necessary. Yeah. Sometimes other devices, sometimes a mobile phone. And
the manifesto does not actually contain any details on exceptions. So the question is, would that help or hinder schools? Because I get that there are issues when it comes to mobile phones in school and in education, but do the benefits outweigh the risks? That's a decision you as a voter have to decide when you're considering whether the Tories get your X or not.
Certainly.
Anyway, October, welfare and work. Tell us about it.
Yes, welfare and work. Their first policy in this section, there is a want to reform disability benefits so that they target people's needs, such as changing a monthly cash payment to treatment or other certain services. That's the word. Other certain services. There will be a change in how the benefit system assesses capability for work, so more people can get back into work with tailored supports rather than relying on benefits. There'll be an overhaul in the sick note system, as has been a fairly recent issue raised in news within the past couple months.
The quote-unquote sick note culture, which I would argue is just mental health becoming more destigmatised, but different people have different opinions, but I happen to disagree with some of those opinions.
Oh, as do I.
Quite strongly.
Yes, so there'll be an overhaul in this system so that GPs can no longer issue these, but rather specialists working with the government, so less people are issued them. I'd like to touch on that because I do think that's quite problematic, because these are going to be...
The manifesto explicitly points out, X amount of people are given sick notes by default. I wouldn't say it's by default, I would say because most people, if you're applying for a sick note, you probably have good reason to apply for it. So I think it's misconstruing causation and correlation and sort of picking the stats deliberately to misrepresent the situation. Of course, you could argue that the policy does serve some purpose, as it will allow, if you get more specialists in the system, it will allow more ability to pinpoint where the issues are.
But then those specialists are
needed.
Going to be bankrolled by the government, which has raised quite a lot of talk on it in the past couple of months. So make it
and also, would it take longer?
Maybe so.
Because specialists harder to access. GPs, well, even to be fair, GPs are very hard to access at the moment.
They really
Specialists,
are.
even
I need an appointment, so I don't expect to get one for another month.
Best of luck.
Yes, I'll need it. Anyway, to continue, there'll be tougher sanctions on those who don't take up suitable job offers so that they can have their benefits removed after a period of around 12 months. The child maintenance service will be reformed to prevent non-compliance, and new laws will be implemented to help crack down on non-payment.
So, it's my understanding that the child maintenance service is basically if you, say, have a divorce or you are in a situation where you need to be paying child maintenance, the child maintenance service enables that. So this is intended to crack down on parents of children that they should be paying child benefit for, not child benefit, but child maintenance for, and refuse to. So if you are currently in recipient of child maintenance from, say, a divorce, or you've gone to court to get that, then this is another policy to pay attention to.
Yes, indeed it is.
Anyway,
I will...
young people.
Yes, I'll move you on to young people. This is kind of our domain, so
This is our domain, and also this is all the policies for the people who can't vote. So if you can't vote, this is the things that will affect you, and that people older than you will be able to basically decide your future based off of. So, what do the Tories want to do? Well, they want to mandate 2 hours of PE every week in primary and secondary school, which includes extending the PE and sport premium, which is extra funding for PE and sports, to secondary schools. They want to work with sporting bodies to create more UK-wide school competitions, and also, as we've heard earlier in the year, introduce a new advanced British standard for sixth form education which will require maths and English until 18. It is unclear whether this would replace or run concurrent to A-levels and T-levels, but it's meant to take the best from both of them. There will be a new register of children not in school to tackle students who don't attend school regularly, and they'll give the parents right to see what a child is taught in school. And this is when we come into the culture war stuff again. They'd introduce clear age limits on what children can be taught and ban kids from being taught about transgender people and gender identity.
I'm going to jump in there because...
I was going to jump in there.
Oh, wow. I've written an article on this semi-recently.
October has written an article on my website. Find it at haydncutler.law.blog. It's in the blog section. It's the one tagged amplified. October has written a great reason as to why this policy might sound like reasonable sense, apart from the transgender people thing, which is mad.
Of course.
But actually could enable abuse and pedophilia and things like that.
Yes, indeed.
Let's just say nasty, negative things.
Indeed. Give it a read. You'll see my perspective on it.
Reading it. And also the part about transgender people, it's weirdly phrased because it calls it contested gender ideology, but if you read the studies, and trust me, I have read the studies because I have nothing else to do with my life, most scientists actually agree on the fact that transgender people, their experiences are valid and real, and that
very real.
I wouldn't argue it's contested by people who don't really have the expertise to contest the situation.
Certainly.
Let's say.
It is a large culture war, and it's cross-party as well.
It's cross-party. Like, this is the Conservatives aren't the only party proposing such a policy.
No.
But lucky, or rather unluckily for us, there's going to be more of such rhetoric later on.
Yes.
So move on. They want to expand academy trusts and preserve the rights of independent and grammar schools, whilst also lifting the cap on faith schools. So the cap on faith schools is basically 50% of students in a faith school is the max amount of students that can be picked explicitly because of their religion. The other 50% have to be, they can't consider religion in admitting them, I believe.
Yep, I read an article on this a while ago.
Yes.
That is exactly it.
They also wish to deliver 60,000 new school places and a further 15 new free schools for SEND children. Now, here's the big one, the headline policy that I'm sure many young people will have heard about and will have had long-running distaste for: national service. Every 18-year-old is to be given a compulsory choice, so you have no method of opting out, and there is little detail on the exceptions that there would be. So if you're in work, there'd be no exception, and if you are abroad, there would be no exceptions. You have to do this. There are few exceptions to those placements. Every 18-year-old is to be given a compulsory choice between 1 weekend a month volunteering for the community, called civic service, and examples given are like volunteering for the NHS or doing things with the RNLI, or a year-long full-time paid placement in the armed forces, with more details to be ironed out by a royal commission. Thoughts, October? Good or bad?
Not good. It's not. We can talk.
It's not volunteering.
Yeah, we can talk semantics really quick, but that doesn't even scratch the surface. It's obviously not volunteering if you have to do it, and the fact that that's not paid, it's going to mess up some people's lives. Maybe not everyone, Maybe some
say
people.
the example I've heard
Go on.
is young carers and the fact
Exactly.
that these people they might only have one weekend off a month, or they might not even have any free time, but they're still going to be either forced into doing that or doing a full-time army placement.
Which is,
And they're
that's
gonna
doubly as,
and sure it's
inaccessible.
paid, but it's a full year in the army. I mean, I'm part of I have Finnish citizenship. I'm a dual citizen, is what I meant to say, between Finland and Britain, and they have military service. But I believe their military service is only 6 months. They still have the civic service option, but they have reasoning because they're right next to Russia. We don't have that problem.
Yeah,
I think our problem is currently with armed forces recruitment rather than the young not doing their lot.
Yeah, and there's another layer of it for me. I don't like the military. I don't like the idea of war in any way. I don't ever think it's necessary. And so having
there's going to be
indoctrination-
conscientious objectors.
Yeah, but that.
Yeah.
Oh, I've actually not given that proper thought. But yeah, exactly. What did you just say?
Conscientious objectors.
That's the one.
Shout out to GCSERS.
That's the one. I never did it. But also, it feels another layer to a propaganda machine, and I have a lot of qualms with it that it's going to take too long to cover now. Certainly.
And ignoring ideological points, it also presents impracticalities, like how are you going to be able to process every request? And if you do force people to do placements either in the army or in the community that they're not a fan of, it's just going to be massively underproductive, and it might even introduce roadblocks to actual
actual services.
Either the armed forces or the community projects actually getting work done, because suddenly they're becoming daycare for 18-year-olds.
Exactly, it's going to put a strain on possibly vital services, and the next couple of points you're about to say.
Anyway,
I will have points on those too. Keep talking.
So. 100,000 more apprenticeships in England every year under the Conservatives, or at least they promise, and also they wish to close university courses with excessive dropout rates or, quote-unquote, that leave students worse off. And that is the Conservative policies on young people.
Yes, indeed. We'll have a little discussion about uni courses, because I think my course I'm going to be doing music and film. I believe that counts as a quote-unquote Mickey Mouse degree.
Yes.
Which, it's gutting that there is even a possibility that if a certain party will get in, they are going to take away from general freedom. It takes away from freedom. Closing uni courses and closing pathways into certain lifestyles and jobs.
Yes.
Apprenticeships I can back, obviously. I think apprenticeships are really cool. And the more
apprenticeships are wonderful.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. I have a different opinion to you on this. I think that, because I remember I mentioned this in episode 2, our conversation about Gamblegate, the Conservatives and Trust, how I believe we should transition to a more German-style system, because in Germany, only for the most theoretical, really STEM subjects, technical courses, you need to go to uni, but most jobs there don't require uni, because if you want to get, say, a job in the city or something like that, you're going to need a uni degree these days.
Yeah, certainly.
And it seems like I don't think that many people should be going to uni, because I believe that, uni should be those more exclusive courses.
Yeah.
But I also believe that you shouldn't need a uni degree, because if you do need a uni...
actually.
Because the policy, that could work in practice, but you would need to reform the job market, and you'd need to push more people to apprenticeships and alternative qualifications. So it does one half of the job of educational reform without committing to the other.
Exactly.
If you get what I mean.
And I think if there was any chance at major job reform, I would hold a very similar view to you, but it just doesn't look likely.
Yes, it doesn't look likely under these plans.
Yes, under these, and I think we'll see in other manifestos under theirs.
Yeah.
I don't think there's enough, there's not enough push for it, unfortunately. What was I going to say?
There isn't a political willingness.
Yeah, exactly. I had another point, but I can't remember what it is.
Well, try to remember...
I have remembered. I was just going to doubly mention the fact that some certain entry-level jobs require experience, they require degrees, and sometimes they're not even, they're not, I don't want to say so important, because every job has its place, but You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, they're meant for people just starting their journey up the career ladder. And for those jobs, should you really need a degree or experience?
Exactly.
Like, for some jobs, I can see where a degree would be valuable and experience would be highly valuable. But we need more entry-level jobs where you can just get in through alternative qualifications such as apprenticeships, etc. And whilst apprenticeships do provide degrees, we need to question whether that's the right practice, because that will still require classroom time. Anyway, we've had a long discussion on degrees, so why don't you take the reins on defence and global affairs?
Yes, indeed. So, the Conservatives plan to spend 2.5 of GDP. I'd like you to define that term because I actually cannot recall what that stands for.
So, GDP is Gross Domestic Product, which is a measure of the size and health of a country's economy over a period of time, usually 1 quarter or 1 year.
Lovely.
It's calculated by collecting data from thousands of UK companies, and there are 3 ways to measure GDP.
Go on.
So, you can calculate it by adding up for everyone in the country the total value of goods and services produced, everyone's income, or what the country has spent. So that is your GDP.
Splendid. The Conservatives plan to spend 2.5 of that on defence by 2030. There are plans to launch a campaign to set a new baseline for all NATO allies to spend this same amount by the same length of time, 2030. There will be a modernisation of the Trident nuclear deterrent, also known as our nuclear arsenal, including a nuclear skills package worth up to 763 million by 2030.
On that point,
Go on.
in our show notes here, the ones me and October are using to reference the Conservative policies, I put nuclear skills package in quotes, and that's because the only details of this so-called nuclear skills package is that it will be worth up to £763 million. So there aren't many details that we just know that they want to modernise the Trident nuclear deterrent. Anyway, continue.
Yes, on that note, it might be good to take policies that are quite brief with a pinch of salt or so.
Yes.
But yes, the maintenance of the Office for Veterans Affairs is a talked about policy with a budget of 10 million to be added throughout the next Parliament. And
I should mention here, I forgot to mention at the start, if you are confused if we say through the next Parliament or until the end of the next Parliament, a parliamentary session is usually just a period of around a year. It can vary, and you can see the state opening and closing of parliaments online, but it's around a year.
Yes, indeed. And to continue, there will be an introduction of a Minister for Veterans Affairs. There are plans to fully implement the finding of the independent review into veterans. There are plans to pass the UK's first ever Veterans Bill to enshrine rights for veterans in law. For example, ensuring qualifications from service are recognised in civilian life and giving the government a legal duty to look after veterans. I'd like to touch on that. I think that is absolutely necessary in society. I think veterans are not treated good in any I say any country. I mainly know about here and the US. I think it's really quite terrible.
I mean, if you do compare us to the US does much more for their veterans, and here we don't. I mean, it's even the small things like the Conservatives, they have a lot on veterans affairs in their manifesto. I haven't included all of it. One thing that I haven't included in the notes that I'll bring up now just to demonstrate how much is that they've even considered the cost of the Veterans Rail Card, and they want to bring that in line with the HM Forces Rail Card. So it's those small actions here that will really change the lives of veterans, assuming the Conservatives get into power.
Yes, indeed.
Well, assuming they get into power and assuming they would actually deliver on their promises, that is.
Which is always questionable for politicians.
Remember, they may not deliver on all of these promises.
Certainly. And to continue, there will be a £10 billion worth investment into munitions productions, partly to guarantee weapons for Ukraine, which is another policy. There will be a target to become the largest defence exporter in Europe by 2030. In 6 years, that is quite a lot to pull off. I wonder if they could do it.
Very ambitious.
Indeed. There will be new defensive treaties with Germany and Poland. There will be a continued effort to raise concerns with the UN about China's disregard for human rights, and use asset freezes and travel bans on those involved.
So on this point,
Go on.
If I could quickly raise,
Yes.
When it says China's disregard for human rights, it specifically mentions in the manifesto Tibet, Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So that's China's crackdown on democratic and the freedom to protest in Hong Kong, and in Tibet and the Xinjiang regions, persecution of Uyghur minorities and other specific minorities in the region in favour of the Han Chinese, and more specifically, like the re-education camps and the general working conditions as well, I think is also an issue in that region. But the bit he does mention specifically, Tibet, Xinjiang and Hong Kong.
Yes, and there's an interesting point that comes up within this manifesto, which almost contradicts this. Am I fine to skip over, or not skip over, am I fine to jump around between parts of these
Well, what point do you want to bring up?
The final point in this section, to ban public bodies from boycotting or diverting against foreign countries and territories.
Yes,
That
so...
seems directly contradictory.
Yes, well, the thing is, I think that's more aimed at public bodies boycotting against Israel. I don't think they've really... I think they've separated the two issues in their mind, because
Yes.
the interesting point on this is also the point above it, which is that they want to recognise a Palestinian state at a quote-unquote at a time that is most conducive to the peace process, which I did not expect to come from the Conservatives. So it does seem interesting how they seem to be very middle of the road on such issues, where it's like, I'm not sure how to put it really.
I know what you mean, but to me, and only to me, this says nothing about my opinions on this manifesto and on the Conservatives. That does seem rather weak as a statement at a time that is most conducive to the peace process.
It's not.
There's
I think
not
it's
much
just
strength to those words.
It fobs it off as like, we want to do it at some point, but that won't be soon whatsoever.
Yes.
So it is a bit.
So that could be a flake out,
squirrely.
very possibly. But again, that is for you to decide and not for me. Now, continuing with the points.
Back to your points.
There are a few more. There will be a finalisation of a free trade agreement with India, a new soft power strategy, continued support for the BBC World Service, and the expansion of the English language worldwide. That's an interesting point.
Yes, it does discuss a lot about making sure the English language is very prominent worldwide, which I found quite interesting, because I didn't think it would be that much of a priority, but alas for the Conservatives, it seems it is, and I can see the idea behind it as soft power, but English, given it's such a widespread language already, would it make that much difference is the question.
That is
so it's really
thought,
it's quite confusing that it's one of the Conservatives' priorities listed in them, or not priorities, it's listed in their manifesto. To be fair, it's towards the end of this section, and it's like 2 paragraphs of, and I happened to notice it, because usually they put their key policies in bold, and this wasn't in bold, but it is there, so interesting thing to note.
And the final bit for this section on defence and global affairs is to introduce a minister for British citizens overseas.
Yes, so the Conservative Party are very committed, well, per se, that their policies, they've got a few policies that do focus on the lives of British citizens overseas, because that is a voting bloc which will be handy to win over.
Indeed. So, that brings us quite nicely onto a somewhat similar theme of immigration within this
Immigration.
manifesto. Take it away.
A key flashpoint in this election.
Certainly.
You've heard a lot about immigration, but what do the Conservatives actually want to do? Well, unsurprisingly, they begin by discussing a regular rhythm of flights to Rwanda from July, so if they win in the election, it's going to be very soon that the planes are leaving the ground, to deport illegal migrants until these small boats stop. So the key purpose of the policy is to act as a deterring measure. And in here, I'd also like to note that they have a vague threat of ignoring any European Court of Human Rights rulings on the matter, but they don't commit to pulling out of the European Court of Human Rights. They simply say, quote unquote, if we are forced to choose between our security and a jurisdiction of a foreign court, including the European Court of Human Rights, we will always choose our security.
Which was a debate point, wasn't it? That was in one of the debates in the previous episode.
They haven't really discussed whether they want to pull out, just that they would, quote unquote, choose their security every time.
Yeah.
They also want to block illegal migrants from bringing legal challenges against their deportation, which we've already seen in the previous parliament.
We have.
And they want to reform asylum rules and work with other countries to reform international laws on migration, with a threat of restricting visa access for countries that refuse to work with them on their priorities. More return deals like the current one with Albania could be in the future, and Parliament could be given control over how many places we offer on safe and legal routes for those with genuine need, with caps based on local capacity.
Would you like to give a little more insight as to what a return deal is for our listeners?
So we have one with Albania right now. If a migrant arrives from Albania on British shores and they're deemed to not fulfil the current requirements, they would be returned to Albania under that deal. So that basically speeds up the process of returning migrants to their country of origin. Back to immigration policies, they want to raise the skilled worker threshold, and they want to require migrants to do a health check before travel and increase their immigration health surcharge or require them to buy health insurance if they, quote unquote, may burden the NHS. I'd like to quick note on the semantics of burden. That's quite a strong rhetoric per se. I mean, would you describe someone going to the NHS with a broken leg as burning them? No, but
No.
I guess the Conservatives see migrants differently per se.
And on that note...
well, not necessarily, but that's it's interesting that they've chosen to use such semantics.
Yes, and on that note, you find a lot of immigrants, or that's rather a broad statement, but you get immigrants within the NHS service, and I think there's been some arguments that politicians have made even, that they do help hold up the NHS. So that's a very interesting claim to be made in a manifesto of all places.
Yes, and also for information point only, when they discuss the immigration health surcharge, if you're coming to the UK from another country and you don't fit a list of exceptions, you have to pay a small amount on top to make sure you can access the NHS. So that's what they mean when they talk about the immigration health surcharge. And the final point, for me at least, when it comes to immigration, is that they want to increase all visa fees and remove the student discount for the immigration health surcharge.
Yes, indeed.
So, any final thoughts, or do you want to move on to health and social care?
Well, I'll reiterate that immigration has been a very strong theme within this election.
Yes.
A lot of it...
I mean, it's the platform Reform UK are
Yes, I was
running
just
Reform
about to
UK
mention.
are mainly targeting Conservative voters, and especially the right wing of the Conservative
Yes.
Party, and it doesn't actually seem like a big priority in their manifesto. I mean, it's a fairly short section, but the policies they do have are quite...
They're punchy, aren't they? They're strong.
They're punchy policies. They're strong. They don't mince words per se. They are. They don't have as much policies as some other sections, as like health and social care. We've got a lot of points to talk about on that one, but the policies that they do have are quite impactful to the situation, let's say.
Yes,
it just depends on
indeed.
whether they would work. I mean, many people are predicting that the Rwanda scheme, if implemented, would fail to solve the situation whatsoever and would not act as a deterrent. So the question is not... the question is really, will they have an impact if implemented?
And I find it almost comical that there has, in the process of trying to get the Rwanda scheme booted up, there has been a struggle to find airlines that will endorse this.
Yes.
Which, that feels like an omen.
I
to me.
believe the current plan, not listed in the manifesto, but from previous interviews, Rishi said, was to use RAF aircraft
Oh,
and
that's
government-owned
bizarre.
aircraft.
That is very bizarre
So,
indeed.
if they don't have planes, they're going to find planes.
Crazy.
Anyway,
Well,
health and social care. Tell us about
moving
it,
on
October.
to health and social care under the Conservatives if they get in for a fifth term. There will be an expansion to the Pharmacy First scheme in order to include menopause support, contraception, and treatment for chest infections.
I should mention the Pharmacy First scheme is basically where, instead of seeing your GP, you can walk into your pharmacy and do basic consultations about a range of issues.
Which I feel will be quite beneficial, at least at the moment, given the current state of waiting times within the NHS.
The stated purpose of that policy is to free up some GP appointments.
On the note of GPs, there is a plan to build or modernise 250 GPs across the country, especially in areas of new housing growth. Is there any indication within the manifesto if that's just Britain or just England rather, or does it include Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales?
I'm unsure. I think there was not any specification. I think it's going to be across the UK.
Fair enough. There's a pledge to build 50 more community diagnostic centres. Yes? 50,
Yes.
Yep. And here's an interesting one, because this was a
Yes,
pledge.
the 40 new hospitals.
You
It's
spoil.
been in
I
their,
was going to read that out. Go on.
it's been in their manifesto since 2019.
Yes.
It was Boris Johnson was a big proponent of it. However,
It didn't happen.
they've come under fire because I think they promised to deliver it by this election, which they haven't done. And because I believe the figure they say is 20 new hospitals, but that includes repairs and renovations to existing hospitals.
Yes.
So it just is one example of how this manifesto is basically like a party's wish list of things they want to do, but they may not be able to deliver on per
Yes,
se.
the Tories were not able to deliver on that for the past 5 years, but they've put it in again for 2030. So think of that what you will. There's a pledge to ensure newly qualified dentists have to work in the NHS for a number of years, or pay back training costs. That's interesting. There's a plan to fully rule out Martha's Rule, giving patients a right to a second opinion. Would you like to go into a little detail on that, Hadyn? Because I've not heard of Martha's Rule.
Martha's Rule, it's a campaign set up after the death of I can't remember exactly.
I'd just like to cut in. I said rule out. It's roll out. So they're introducing it.
Yes, they want to roll out Martha's Rule, which is basically done after, I believe it was a young girl who died after the doctors failed to diagnose a certain issue, and which the parents did raise as a possibility. I can't remember the exact details, but it basically allows patients the right to a second opinion if they believe the initial diagnosis or medical suggestions are incorrect from a doctor.
Interesting. There'll be a reduction in the number of NHS managers by 5,500. There'll be the publishing and implementation of a major condition strategy, and continue work to take forward the Rare Diseases Action Plan. Another fairly
well-known policy.
Yes, well-known policy and speaking point, or I should say talking point, that's the right word. Another talking point as of recent, bring forward the tobacco and vapes bill. Anything to say on that before we move on?
So, the tobacco and vapes bill is more widely known as the plan to ban anyone who was born, I believe, after the year 2008 onwards. Something like that. I can't remember the specific details on the bill. It's basically the plan to ban a generation of people from buying cigarettes or vapes. It was considered one of Rishi Sunak's flagship policies, and he said in an interview he'd like that to be his legacy. Whether he achieves it is yet to be seen, but it's back in the Conservatives' manifesto.
Yes, very interesting indeed. I'll only mention this briefly. I think Farage used this as a speaking point, which this never happens, me agreeing with Nigel Farage, but I did kind of. He said everyone should have a choice to buy it, and I think there definitely needs to be more addiction services in place. But I think the choice to buy it...
I could see it working as long as they treat it well, because I do think it's a policy that I think is actually quite needed. The thing is, I don't think the UK has the right infrastructure in place to deal with any black markets cropping up.
Yes, and they do when drugs are banned.
Any sort of...
They absolutely do.
And also rehab support. So I think, should smoking be banned? Should vapes be banned for a generation of people? Yes, it's something that all major health organisations agree that is desperately needed. But if we are going to do it, we need to have proper investment in public health infrastructure to ensure we can combat the side effects that will inevitably crop up as a result of the law. No, continue.
Yes, to continue. There will be further restrictions on the advertising of products high in fat, salt and sugar. There will be new digital health checks for 250,000 more people each year to help prevent strokes and heart attacks. The Conservatives want to implement the HIV Action Plan to end new HIV transmissions by 2030. God, there's a lot happening if they get in 6 years, isn't there?
Yes, I think 2030 is like the biggest deadline that they use for most of their plans.
Of course. And there will be the expansion of HIV opt-out testing in emergency departments, subject to consultation. There'll be the use of AI to free up nurses' time for frontline patient care. That's an interesting point. don't know how I feel about that.
ChatGPT could diagnose your illnesses.
Let's
Think
go.
about that, folks.
They can write your essays, they can diagnose you.
I don't think it's going to be ChatGPT, I should clarify.
Of course, that is a private company, I believe. The Conservatives want to bring forward a comprehensive national strategy for maternity care and deliver additional funding for maternity safety and improve access to mental health services for new mums. I think that's rather a good policy.
Yes.
Because mums specifically absolutely need further support postpartum. There is so little of it, and it harms families. It harms
It is
public.
something that's desperately needed. Yes.
Indeed. And on that note, on the note of women's health, there will be an expansion of women's health hubs so that every integrated care system has at least one hub, and continued...
For note, integrated care systems are just regional health boards. So if you see like X Place NHS Trust, that's an integrated care system, I believe. It's basically the regional NHS staff group system.
Interesting. The Conservatives want to support continued research into disparities in maternal care. They want to cover 100% of schools and colleges in England with mental health support teams by 2030, as well as opening early support hubs for those aged 11 to 25 in every local community, again by 2030. The Tories want to pass a new law to provide better treatment and support for severe mental health needs, which is direly needed.
It's direly needed, and it's right before the culture war comes back.
Yes, it is a very...
Because we have the CAS review.
Oh, yes. And that is my next point. The Conservatives want to implement recommendations of the CAS review, including restricting young people's access to gender transitioning help and support, and legislation to permanently prevent the private prescription, oh my god, that's a lot of P's, and supply of puberty blockers. Now, interesting point. I believe that there was something passed that had puberty blockers banned.
Yes, so puberty blockers are currently restricted if on a private subscription. To get them through an NHS subscription, I believe you need to be on a research trial, or you must already have a valid prescription. And I will also, a point on the CAS review, I would like to mention it is highly disputed and has been found by multiple academics to be highly flawed. So if you do see politicians talking about, oh, we'll do X, Y, Z about trans people because of the CAS review, then take their facts with a pinch of salt, per se, because
perhaps
it was
an
not,
ocean of salt.
It wasn't the most unbiased review, let's say. So is it a good idea to implement the recommendations of the CAS review? Maybe not. I mean, even Dr. Hilary Cass herself has come out and said, actually, I don't think we should restrict puberty blockers that much, etc., in an interview with some organisations that I've read up on. So if you are interested about the CAS review, do some research into it. Look at the articles from a lot of the academics who've come out against it, and especially the evidence review process, because it is quite interesting, and it's quite interesting that a lot of parties are wholly in favour of the recommendations considering the evidence against it.
Very bizarre. But moving...
Still, back onto the culture war. Another culture war point.
Indeed. Moving on. The Conservatives pledge to give every patient the right to single-sex accommodation and same-sex intimate care.
So that means that basically means banning trans people from the from hospital wards that they would would fit with their gender identity, which is massively impractical. Because, to be honest, I don't think women would want trans men in women's wards either.
I wouldn't exactly want to be on a women's ward if I needed to.
Exactly. So at that point, you could only make separate trans wards for people, and that's massively impractical.
Yes, it's impractical and can, culture prejudice naturally.
Yeah. Culture war, innit?
In it.
Anyway.
Yes. 2
more points.
Indeed. My second to last. Conservatives want to introduce a new licensing scheme and age limits for non-surgical cosmetic products. Procedures. Yes.
Back to policies I like.
And the final one from the Conservatives on health and social care is to pay comprehensive compensation to those affected by the infected blood scandal and give a further £210,000 interim payment to living infected beneficiaries. Any thoughts?
well, the compensation is sorely needed. That's all I have to say.
Yes, indeed.
Shall we move on to crime and justice?
Why not? I will pass it back to you.
Everything around policing and crime and laws and, toughening up that stuff. So, firstly, they want to give every neighbourhood a police officer by recruiting 8,000 more police officers, and they will license police officers for specialist roles and legislate to ensure that officers are appropriately vetted during service and those who fail vetting are sacked. They want to introduce Martin's Law, which was proposed in the wake of the Manchester arena bombing, and is named after one of the victims of the bombing, which will ensure that premises are better prepared for terrorist attacks by requiring them to take steps to mitigate risk. They want to increase the use of community payback, more commonly known as community service. Is that was?
I believe so, yeah.
Yes, community service. And also electronic tagging. They want to ban SIM farms and cold call. They want to ban SIM farms and cold calls on financial products, as well as introducing a 25-year prison term for domestic murders and a review of homicide sentencing. They'll introduce an aggravating factor for murders that happen during quote-unquote rough intercourse, so they can't be used as an excuse for a lighter sentence, which actually has happened in real court cases.
It has, unfortunately.
And they'll make life in prison without parole mandatory for more of the most heinous murderers, and require rapists and other serious sexual offenders to spend the whole of their life sentence behind bars.
Oh, good.
The Conservatives promise to toughen sentencing for knife crime, grooming gangs and assaults against retail workers, and require offenders to attend hearings. They want to build 4 new prisons, remove more foreign national offenders, and introduce a permanent independent public advocate for major disasters like your Hillsborough, your Grenfell and your Manchester Arena terrorist attack, as well as restricting sex offenders from changing their names. They wish to fund 100 new criminal law pupilages, as well as introducing further powers to ban face coverings, pyrotechnics, and climbing on war memorials, as well as strengthening police powers to prevent protests or marches, and banning protests outside of schools. Thoughts? Well, we're seeing more of the restricting protests, which I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of per se, because
I'm certainly not.
I'm one to fundamentally believe in the human right to protest and to assemble.
Yes.
And also, I think it's a lot of interesting how their crime and justice policies mainly focus on they don't address the root cause of the issue. Rather, they they push it aside in prisons per se, which I don't think is often the best strategy. For some crimes, it does work. I will admit that, and I think some of these policies would be good and are sorely needed. Yeah. But would it address the root cause? That's a bigger question.
Yeah, and I've definitely got my qualms with the policing system. I don't think it's working. I think it's broken, and I think more police officers, more plod, for lack of nicer terms, I don't think that's going to work. And I'd like to...
I could see it working in some communities, especially if it's like... what they used to call bobbies on the beat. I can't remember the new term for it, but...
Yeah.
I think it could work if it's done in conjunction with the community, but if it's done wrong, I think it will go tremendously wrong.
Yes, and I'd like to link back to extra steps taken for prepping for terrorist attacks. That, in our society at the moment, I think that's a very slippery slope. I think that's going to lead to profiling.
Yeah, I don't think it's that. I think the Martin's Law point, I think it's just to make sure premises have, plans in the case of terrorism. So
Fair enough.
If a bomb goes off, where will the staff be? Where will the emergency exits be? How will people flow from exits? How will evacuations take place? I can see the slippery slope point, but I don't think that law will particularly lead to that. Because it's going to be private enterprises preparing for what happens in the immediate aftermath, rather than stopping it at the source.
Okay, fair. Well, I'd also like to add I think this is quite personal to me, naturally. So, child sex crimes. There's not much of a mention on that.
No,
and I think it's a rising crime. It's happening everywhere.
think it would come under serious sexual offenders.
Yes, likely.
So they would spend their whole life sentence behind bars, but it was not mentioned by name. The grooming gangs are mentioned, and the Conservatives, they'll toughen sentences for them, but I don't think there was much detail on that. So
very little,
if that is one of your main concerns, then the Conservatives
may not be for you.
You you might want to look at other parties' manifestos,
Yes.
but we'll be covering every party's manifestos in the upcoming days to
We
ensure
will be.
you can make the most informed decision with your vote.
Yes, I would like to see in other manifestos. What was I going to say? Hang about. More on catching said criminals, because I think that has been something I have dealt with. 3 years since reporting, nothing. But moving on. That is another story for another day.
So, environment.
Yes, environment.
Would you like to share
Yes.
their thoughts on it?
Environment. The Conservatives want to commit to delivering net zero by 2050, which is interesting, I think, because I might be mistaken. Have some Conservative MPs and politicians been talking about wanting to scrap that? Or is that mainly Reform and other right-wing parties?
Some Reform want to scrap net zero targets. Some Conservative politicians aren't in fan of net zero targets, but their main view is we want to deliver net zero in a way that's like practical for the British people and doesn't cost too much. So I think they want to do net zero, but they want to do it in a way that, they don't have to spend too much money, because it's not one of the Conservatives' main concerns. I don't think they'll be losing their sleep if they exactly miss that target.
Yes, indeed. Continuing, the Tories want to ensure annual licensing rounds for oil and gas production in the North Sea. The North Sea, that's the word. They want to build new gas power stations, treble offshore wind capacity, build up the first 2 carbon capture and storage clusters, and the Conservatives want to scale up nuclear power by approving 2 new fleets of small modular reactors and by halving the time it takes for new nuclear power reactors to be approved, which is interesting.
It's quite. I think it's quite a good policy. I think nuclear is sorely needed in the UK, and it's needed to transition to a more net zero future. Let's
Most
say,
certainly.
and the nuclear wastage. I actually recently saw an image to store. I believe it was like 50 years worth of nuclear waste. It doesn't actually take up that much space.
Yeah.
And given new emerging technologies and proven technologies, nuclear is safer, more efficient, and less wasteful than ever.
Absolutely. I don't know how I feel about halving the time it takes for checks and whatnot to be approved.
I don't think it's checks. I think it's more just the planning permission. So picking the location, getting all the requirements to build it. I think the safety, I'd hope that they keep in place, but
you never know.
They didn't have that much detail on what they meant by halving the time.
Okay. There are also plans to build a new gigawatt power plant in Wilfer, I believe I say that, in North Wales.
No, it's if you know WYLFA in North Wales, you'll love that policy.
Yes.
Or unless you hate power plants, in which case you'll hate that policy.
Sorry, Welsh listeners, I am uneducated on the language. The Conservatives want to implement a new import carbon pricing mechanism by 2027 to charge the imports of materials produced in countries with a lower or no carbon price. They want to ensure that...
So
go on.
On that point, if the material comes from a country where they don't have a carbon pricing scheme, it's basically going to be charged when it enters the UK as if it was made in the UK under the UK's carbon pricing scheme, which I didn't know existed, but the Conservative Manifesto implies exists, so I'm sure it exists in some government policy somewhere.
Yes, indeed. Where was I? The Conservatives, in their manifesto, want to ensure that green levies on household bills are lower, and that no new further green... I am saying that right, levies, I believe.
Yes, levies.
Yes. No new further green levies, road pricing schemes, or frequent flyer levies are implemented. They want to deliver the Pump Watch scheme so that petrol retailers are forced to share live information on their prices. They want to fund an energy efficiency voucher scheme open to every household in England to support the installation of energy efficiency measures and solar panels. And finally, the Conservatives, they want to ensure democratic consent for offshore wind, ensuring local communities benefit, and support solar in the right places and not in agricultural land. Any thoughts?
I have no thoughts. Do you have any thoughts? Because I think it's best we move on to housing.
I don't particularly have much to say on that. Let's move on.
Well, the Tories and housing. Firstly, they want to abolish EU nutrient neutrality rules to allow more developments. I don't have much information on nutrient neutrality rules because when I looked into it, it seemed very let's just say it's a very complicated one, not simple enough to explain on a podcast, so
Yeah,
I'll leave that to listeners if they want to look into. But that basically more developments, but slightly worse for the environment.
Yes, that
They want to
seems like
deliver
something I've researched a bit in A-level biology. I don't
Yes.
know how that would work well for our land. But I won't
But it
elaborate.
would work well for development, so it depends. Are you pro-housing or pro the environment? That's the choice you have to make this election.
Indeed.
They also want to deliver a record number of homes each year on brownfield land in urban areas, as well as raising the density levels in inner London to match those of European cities like Paris and Barcelona. They want to support local and smaller builders by requiring councils to set aside land for them, as well as renewing the Affordable Homes programme and retaining the commitment to protect the green belt from uncontrolled development. They want to make the increase to the threshold at which first-time buyers pay stamp duty, introduced in 2022, permanent, as well as launching a new and improved Help to Buy scheme, which provides first-time buyers with an equity loan of up to 20% towards the cost of a new build home. And they want to promise not to increase the number of council tax bans, no expensive council tax re-evaluations, as well as no cuts to the council tax discount. One idea they have is 2-year capital gains tax relief for landlords who sell to their existing tenants, as well as delivering the court reforms necessary to abolish Section 21 evictions, basically evictions without reason, and strengthen other grounds on which landlords can evict tenants for antisocial behaviour. They want to ensure councils have the powers they need to manage uncontrolled growth of holiday lets, as well as further speeding up the use and enforcement of powers to remove illegal traveller sites. Any thoughts?
That last point. I don't think there's nearly enough support for I don't pronounce it like that. I learnt that from Peaky Blinders. Romani and traveller communities. I don't think that can go well. Adding to the enforcement powers.
My opinions on power enforcement are mixed, to say the least, because on one hand they need more support and more camping sites, but on the other hand, especially in my local area, I've seen the effect it can have if the enforcement is not strong enough, so I have mixed opinions. I'll leave it at that. A quick interruption to the podcast. October has left us as his mic has broken, so he is having technical issues as of present. He should be able to return for the next episode, so I will provide you with a quick summary of the final few sections. Firstly, we have communities. The Conservatives want to provide 105 towns in the UK with a £20 million endowment fund for local people to change their town's future. They want to extend the Community Ownership Fund to help more communities across the UK take control of vital community assets. They plan to create more free ports and business rate retention zones, as well as changing planning laws to bring back local market days and to regenerate defunct shopping centres. They want to raise the fines utility firms must pay when they create street scars by not properly restoring roads and pavements after works are completed, as well as making fly tipping an offence that carries penalty points on your driving licence. They'll give every part of England a devolution deal if they want one by 2030, as well as launching a seaside heritage fund and banning mayors and local councils from introducing LES or ULEZ schemes. This would also involve reversing the ULEZ expansion in London, and would lead to policies to require any new low traffic neighbourhood or 20 mph schemes to be put to a referendum, as well as introducing a right to challenge existing schemes. They want to extend the £2 bus fare cap for the entirety of the next Parliament, as well as making sure there are no new smart motorways, and introducing the Rail Reform Bill to create Great British Railways, a private-public partnership that will grow the role of the private sector in the rail industry and support the expansion of open access operators. They want to roll out mobile pay-as-you-go contactless tickets nationwide, as well as introducing penalties for dangerous cycling when it results in death or injury, as well as maintaining Royal Mail's current 6-day service. They'll repeal convictions of those affected by the Post Office Horizon scandal, as well as maintaining First Past the Post, which is the voting system we have in the UK, voting age and voter ID. They plan to rewrite the Equality Act to ensure that transgender people cannot access the rights that align with their gender identity, and legislate so that an individual can only have one sex in the eyes of the law in the United Kingdom. There aren't any further details on that, so if you don't understand it, I don't either. They have no commitment to ban conversion therapy. When it comes to food and agriculture, they want to increase the UK-wide farming budget by £1 billion over the next Parliament, as well as introducing a legally binding target to enhance our food security. They'll look at reforming the planning system so that the building of infrastructure in farms is fast-tracked, as well as moving away from the reliance on seasonal migrant labour with a 5-year visa-tapered scheme. As well as this, they'll replicate the £100 million UK Seafood Fund. On rural areas in nature, they'll maintain the moratorium on deep-sea mining and ratify the Global Oceans Treaty, as well as banning executive bonuses if a water company commits a serious criminal breach. They'll extend the £15 water rebate for those in the southwest across the next Parliament, and use fines from water companies to invest in river restoration projects. They'll reform the price review regulatory process for water companies and launch a new design competition for urban greening, as well as cutting red tape that holds back the planting of trees in the planning system. They'll designate an 11th national park and improve existing national parks and protected landscapes, and support programmes that encourage disadvantaged children and young people to access green spaces. They'll continue to develop a UK-wide deposit return scheme, so that's like returning your bottles like they do in many other countries. Finland's one example I know, and I've used before, is basically you bring your plastic bottle back to the store, chuck it in a machine, and you get like 15 pence. And they'll prevent new waste incinerators being built. On culture, they'll introduce an independent football regulator, ensure our creative sector tax incentives remain competitive, launch a review into England's nighttime economy, and introduce a new complaints process for the BBC so it does not mark its own homework, as the manifesto says itself. And finally, the Union and its nations. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland finally getting mentioned on the podcast. Abby, I know you're listening, I hope you're happy. They promise £3 billion of levelling up investment for Scotland, £2.5 billion for Wales and £1 billion for levelling up projects in Northern Ireland. They'll extend the UK Shared Prosperity Fund for another 3 years with £540 million a year for communities across Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and they'll press the US government for the permanent removal of tariffs on Scotch whisky. So all our American Scotch whisky drinkers, you better be glad that the Tories are proposing such a policy platform. They want to establish a new UK intertrade body to promote trade within the UK, as well as using the powers in the Scotland Act to require the Scottish Government to produce reports on how new fishing and farming funding will be used. There's improvements to road and rail connectivity promised across Scotland, as well as funding for the M4 Relief Road and the third Menai crossing in Wales, as well as electrifying the North Wales main line. They'll reverse the 20-mile-per-hour blanket speed limit in Wales, and they are recommitting, as ever, to the Good Friday Agreement for Northern Ireland, as well as continued efforts to end all forms of parliamentary activity for good. This section of the manifesto also repeats many of the UK-wide policies, and separate manifestos for Scotland and Wales are available online. Speaking of separate manifestos and the manifesto itself, if you do want to read the whole manifesto, say there's a policy that you may be a fan of but you want to know the details, or you simply just are very curious about what the Conservatives want to propose, their manifesto is available online at manifesto.conservatives.com, and we'll be sure to link it in the show notes. But that will be it for today's episode. I'm sorry October hasn't been able to join me until the end. Again, tech issues. He will be back for the next episode when we cover Labour's manifesto. So yes, tomorrow is Labour, then the Lib Dems, and the day after, the Greens and Reform UK will get a joint episode as they have shorter manifestos than the other parties. We will not be covering any other parties' manifestos, but if you live in, say, a devolved nation or have some local smaller parties running in your area, I'd highly recommend finding their manifestos and having a read through, see what policies they propose. They might sway your vote a little bit. But for now, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at copolitical_pod, as well as at copolitical on TikTok, and find us online at copolitical.co.uk. That's copolitical.co.uk. And thank you, as always, very much for listening. Bye-bye.